He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a polite one. It was the laugh of someone absolutely certain that he stood above everything and everyone. When the grease-stained boy said, "I can fix it," standing in front of a broken Bugatti right in the middle of Reforma Avenue, the millionaire didn't see courage. He saw audacity. What he didn't know was that, in that exact second, he was about to be exposed to the entire world. Because this isn't just the story of a luxury car that broke down in the middle of an avenue. It's the story of how money can blind, how pride turns people into easy targets, and how ignored talent finds unexpected ways to assert itself. A boy with no famous last name, no connections, no appropriate appearance, put everything that man believed about power into question. The most unsettling part wasn't the repair. It was the silence that followed. The silence of the people who had laughed before. The silence of the millionaire when he realized he hadn't just lost a bet, but control of his own image. And the most shocking part is that this was only the beginning. Because when the internet steps in, there is no undo button. While millions watched the video, something even bigger was forming behind the scenes. Envy, sabotage, persecution, and a desperate attempt to erase someone who was never supposed to be seen. But this story doesn't follow the usual comfortable script. Here the system reacts. The neighborhood reacts. And the truth demands the full price. If you think this ends with applause and an easy finale, stay until the end. Because what this boy built wasn't just an improbable repair. It was an uncomfortable mirror for those who always believe that money buys respect. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because stories like this don't come around every day. And some truths only make sense when you watch until the very last second. The sound wasn't a violent explosion. It was worse than that. It was a long, metallic choke, followed by a strange silence that didn't belong on Reforma Avenue. The Bugatti, admired by everyone just minutes earlier, began to lose power right in the middle of heavy traffic. Carlos felt the steering wheel stiffen in his hands as the dashboard flashed warnings he had never seen before. The car slowed down without asking permission, as if it had chosen that exact spot to stop and expose something that wasn't meant to be seen. A thin stream of white smoke escaped from the hood, faint at first, but enough to draw attention. Within seconds, traffic turned into an irritated organism. Horns began to blare from all directions, timid at first, then aggressive. Drivers rolled down their windows, stared, pointed. This wasn't an ordinary car broken down. It was a Bugatti. A status symbol stuck like any other vehicle. Carlos felt his face heat up as he tried to restart the engine, ignoring the persistent warning chime. The attempt only made the smoke thicken, as if the car itself were reacting to the humiliation of its owner. People began getting out of their cars. Cell phones appeared by instinct. Someone laughed. Another commented too loudly. A tourist asked to take a photo. Carlos realized, with a new kind of discomfort, that in that moment he wasn't being admired. He was being watched. The car that had always protected him, that had always opened doors, now worked like a cruel spotlight. Every second stopped there seemed to tear away a piece of the image he had built over the years. The midday heat mixed with the smell of fuel and hot metal. Carlos yanked the door open, stepped out, and slammed it shut even harder, as if the car itself were to blame. He lifted the hood without knowing exactly what he was looking for, only to appear in control. Steam rose slowly, dancing in the air like a provocation. Nothing made sense to him, but he refused to admit that in public. The silence inside his own head was deafening. Someone shouted that traffic was backed up for blocks. Another driver threatened to call the police. Carlos felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: vulnerability. There were no bodyguards, no meetings, no power there. Just an ordinary man standing next to a useless multimillion-dollar car. He hurriedly pulled his phone from his pocket, trying to reclaim some form of authority through the screen. He needed a quick solution. He needed to get out of there before it turned into a full spectacle. As he dialed the dealership, he noticed that some people were already recording videos without any shame. The broken-down Bugatti became the setting. The smoke became a special effect. And he, without realizing it, became a character. Reforma Avenue did not forgive weakness. Every horn sounded like collective laughter. Carlos took a deep breath, trying to control the irritation rising inside him, silently promising that someone would pay for this. The attendant on the other end of the line spoke far too calmly. Carlos cut him off, demanding priority, explanations, immediate solutions. The problem was that nothing seemed to obey the hierarchy he was used to. The car remained dead. The smoke didn't stop. The crowd grew. And time, for the first time, seemed to be working against him. The feeling of ridicule began to seep in where confidence once lived. He looked around and noticed something that bothered him even more. There was curiosity on people's faces but also judgment. Ordinary people, workers, students, watched that expensive man trapped by an expensive machine that didn't work. It was as if, for a few minutes, the world had reversed positions. Carlos felt his jaw tighten. This couldn't end like that. That was when he heard a different voice, lower, almost lost in the noise of the avenue. A voice that didn't come from a car or a phone or someone laughing. A voice that felt out of place in that scene of broken luxury. Carlos didn't know it yet, but that sound wasn't coming to help traffic. It was coming to completely change the course of that story. Carlos stepped a few paces away from the car, pressing the phone hard against his ear, as if he could squeeze answers out of the other end of the line. The dealership answered too quickly for someone who was used to being a priority. He explained the situation in a few words, trying to keep his tone firm, but irritation leaked through the short pauses and heavy breathing. The attendant asked for the VIN, made technical questions, and responded with a calm that only heightened the tension. Every second stopped there felt like another public defeat piling up. When he heard the word tow truck, something inside him locked up. It wasn't just a mechanical issue. It was the image of a Bugatti being towed in the middle of Reforma Avenue, surrounded by recording phones, that made his stomach tighten. Carlos cut off the explanation, demanding an immediate solution, an exclusive team, anything that didn't involve that scenario. The response came dry, professional, almost indifferent. The tow truck would take at least 2 hours to arrive. Maybe more because of traffic. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying not to explode right there. 2 hours meant more horns, more videos, more comments. It meant becoming a joke. He paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair, unaware that he was being watched with growing attention. The man who always gave orders was now waiting. And that reversal irritated him more than the broken car. Carlos returned to the Bugatti and kicked the tire with restrained force, as if that might release something. It didn't. The car remained motionless, silent, and provoking. He thought about his commitments, the people waiting for him, the looks that always showed respect. None of that seemed to matter on that stretch of the avenue. There he was, just another stalled driver, only with a car too expensive to fail like that. The call ended without any miraculous solution. Carlos shoved the phone into his pocket in anger and looked around, trying to calculate the damage to his image. Some people were already talking among themselves, others smiling, others simply watching. This wasn't a simple inconvenience. It was a direct attack on the pride he had built so carefully. And wounded pride doesn't accept witnesses. He leaned against the hood, taking deep breaths, trying to regain his posture. He thought about ordering everyone away, shouting, calling the police, doing anything that might restore some authority. But the truth was cruel. At that moment he had no control at all. The Bugatti wouldn't respond. The dealership wasn't rushing. And the audience wouldn't look away. That was when Carlos noticed a different presence among the people. It wasn't someone laughing. It wasn't someone filming. It was someone standing still, observing the car with unusual attention. There was no hurry in that gaze. No idle curiosity. There was something more technical, almost focused. Carlos didn't know it yet, but that detail was beginning to shift the focus away from humiliation toward something unexpected. While the noise of the avenue continued, that figure moved closer slowly, ignoring the tense atmosphere and the car's value. Carlos, trapped in his own pride, still didn't imagine that the next interaction wouldn't come from the dealership, the tow truck, or anyone from his world. And that would make everything even more uncomfortable. That was when Carlos heard light footsteps approaching, different from the hurried sounds of irritated drivers. When he turned his head, he saw a thin boy, simple clothes, grease stains spread across his hands and t-shirt. The kid didn't seem intimidated by the car, nor by the man standing beside it. His gaze was fixed on the Bugatti, more specifically on the still hot hood, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Fernando stopped at a respectful distance, without invading space, without asking for permission out loud. He took a deep breath and spoke softly, almost as if he didn't want to draw attention. He said he might be able to help. He didn't ask for money. He didn't hold out his hand. He simply pointed toward the engine, with the natural ease of someone who dealt with that kind of thing every day. The offer felt out of place in that scene of luxury and tension. Carlos took a few seconds to react. The contrast bothered him. A car worth more than many houses, stalled in front of a grease-stained boy offering help as if it were something simple. The businessman sized the kid up quickly, from head to toe, trying to understand where he had come from. Fernando kept a steady posture, unhurried, unbothered, as if time were on his side. The boy explained that he had heard the strange sound from the engine even before he saw the smoke. He said that kind of choking wasn't common and that maybe the problem wasn't as serious as it looked. He spoke carefully, choosing simple words without trying to sound like more than he was. Traffic was still stopped, but for a moment the surrounding chaos seemed to fade. Some people began paying attention to the interaction. Curious silence replaced part of the honking. Fernando, indifferent to the stares, stepped a little closer and studied the smoke carefully. His fingers moved in the air as if mentally assembling the engine's parts. There was no arrogance. Only concentration. Carlos felt a strange mix of irritation and disbelief. That offer made no sense in his world. The boy didn't seem to understand who he was talking to, or the value of what he was offering to touch. And somehow that unsettled the businessman. He was used to being treated with deference. Fernando didn't treat him any way at all. He spoke only to the car. Then the boy added that he didn't even need to touch anything to know if he was right. He just needed to listen once more. He tilted his head slightly, attentive to an almost imperceptible clicking sound coming from the hot engine. Carlos realized that this kid was seeing something he, surrounded by technology and money, couldn't see. The discomfort grew. Not because of the car, but because of the situation. A simple boy offering help where specialists would fail for hours. Carlos felt his pride tighten again, as if that scene threatened something bigger than his patience. He still hadn't answered, but the way he looked at Fernando made it clear that this conversation was about to take a dangerous turn. Carlos let out a short, dry laugh, loud enough for those nearby to hear. It wasn't spontaneous. It was defensive. He ran a hand over his face, shook his head in disbelief, and finally looked at Fernando not as someone offering help, but as an out-of-place nuisance. He said that the car wasn't a toy and that no one was going to touch it, least of all a grease-stained kid in the middle of the street. Some people laughed along almost reflexively. Others simply watched, waiting for the next move. Carlos noticed the reaction and felt back in control again, as if the collective laughter restored part of the authority he had lost minutes earlier. He raised his voice a little more, making it clear that he wouldn't trust a $1 million car to someone who clearly didn't belong in that environment. Every word was chosen to create distance. Fernando didn't step back. He didn't respond either. He stood there listening with the same attentive look as before. That bothered Carlos more than a sharp reply would have. The boy's silence didn't seem submissive. It seemed like conviction. Even so, the businessman went on, saying that this kind of attempt was common, that there was always someone trying to take advantage of the situation, pretending to know more than they really did. A man in the crowd made a joking comment. A woman pulled out her phone to record more closely. The atmosphere began to turn into a spectacle. Carlos, feeling the crowd's implicit support, pushed further. He said that if the boy made a mistake, the damage would be absurd. He said he wouldn't allow a childish error to make the situation even worse. Each sentence added another layer of public humiliation. Fernando took a deep breath. His shoulders moved slightly, but he remained steady. He didn't apologize. He didn't insist. He simply said calmly that he didn't need to touch anything if Carlos didn't want him to. That simple response, almost too polite, clashed completely with the businessman's aggressive tone. And that began to split the looks around them. Carlos realized the control wasn't absolute. Some faces were no longer laughing. Some were watching the boy with renewed curiosity. That irritated him. He needed to end the situation. With a quick gesture, he pointed away and told Fernando to leave before someone got hurt. The words sounded like an order. Like an expulsion. The boy took a small step back, but before moving away completely, he cast one last look at the still smoking engine. It wasn't defiance. It was assessment. As if he were memorizing something important. Carlos didn't notice, but that look carried more information than any electronic diagnostic. As Fernando slowly walked away, the sound of the hot engine ticking drew attention again. A specific noise, short, almost rhythmic. The same one that had drawn the boy in from the beginning. Carlos crossed his arms, trying to ignore it, but something about that sound began to bother him in a different way. And without realizing it, the contempt that seemed to end the scene had just planted a silent doubt. A doubt that didn't come from the boy or the crowd, but from the car itself, which kept insisting on failing in that strange way. Fernando hadn't gone far. He stopped just a few meters away, like someone who hadn't finished something inside yet. The sound of the engine kept echoing in his head, repetitive, irregular, almost like a persistent warning. Without coming any closer, he closed his eyes for a moment and listened carefully, ignoring the horns, the voices, and the laughter around him. To him, that noise said more than any electronic dashboard ever could. He opened his eyes and spoke without raising his voice, almost like a comment released into the air. He said the problem wasn't coming from the engine itself. He said it wasn't common overheating, nor a general failure. He gestured toward the system's direction, explaining that that kind of white smoke, combined with the irregular choking, pointed to something specific. It didn't sound like a guess. It sounded like a precise reading. Some people began to truly pay attention now. The boy's tone wasn't that of someone trying to prove something. It was technical, direct, simple. He explained that the metallic sound appeared at the same interval every time, which ruled out certain obvious defects. He spoke like someone who had heard that before many times in different cars under worse conditions. The contrast between the knowledge and the appearance became impossible to ignore. Carlos tried to interrupt, saying it didn't make sense that a car at that level had sensors for everything. Fernando nodded in agreement without irony. He said that was exactly why the defect went unnoticed. When everything is automated, small mechanical failures can hide for longer. The explanation landed in the air, uncomfortable. The boy then mentioned a specific component, something too small to draw immediate attention, but essential to the system's balance. He said that when it failed that way, the car went into protection mode, even without clear alerts. There was no need to open the hood to know. The car was saying everything through sound and smoke. Silence took over part of the avenue again. Even those who had been laughing now watched with curiosity. Carlos felt the discomfort grow not because he fully believed it but because he couldn't refute it. That explanation made too much sense to come from nowhere. And that irritated him deeply. Fernando finished by saying the fix wouldn't require new parts, just proper adjustment and repositioning. He spoke as if describing something simple, routine. Nothing in his posture suggested nervousness. Nothing suggested fear of being wrong. He was simply stating it, with the natural ease of someone who knows his trade. Carlos realized that the crowd's attention was no longer on him. It was on the boy. On the kid who had been humiliated minutes earlier and was now calmly explaining what specialists would take hours to diagnose. That shook something deeper than pride. It shook the logic of power he had always believed he controlled. And before Carlos could decide how to react, he heard hurried footsteps approaching from behind, familiar voices, laughter a little too loud for that tense atmosphere. The scene was about to gain new spectators. And with them, a new level of exposure. The voices arrived before the people. Loud laughter, offhand remarks, that tone of someone who recognizes a rare opportunity for entertainment. Caio emerged between the stalled cars with his phone already in hand, camera on, smile ready. Behind him came other partners, well-dressed, curious, clearly more interested in the scene than in the problem. To them this wasn't a setback. It was an unexpected episode in the middle of the day. Caio approached the Bugatti like someone stepping onto a stage. He made a point of framing the car, the smoke, Carlos with his arms crossed, and finally the boy standing a few meters ahead. He commented out loud about the bad luck of the day, about how even perfect machines fail. The tone was joking but there was something more there. A quiet pleasure in watching control slip from the hands of someone powerful. Carlos tried to interrupt, asking for discretion, but Caio was already live. The phone became an extension of the spectacle. He narrated the situation for those watching on the other side of the screen, exaggerating details, provoking reactions. He said a kid was trying to fix a Bugatti in the middle of the avenue. He laughed. The other partners joined in, encouraging it. Fernando felt the stares multiply. Not just from those present, but from the invisible ones connected through that camera. Even so, he didn't move. He didn't seem intimidated. He watched everything in silence as if he were evaluating not the people, but the entire environment. To him, the human noise was just another secondary sound. Caio moved the camera closer to the boy, asking if he really believed what he had said. The question came loaded with irony, expecting an embarrassed reaction. Fernando answered briefly, saying the car had a simple problem and that he didn't need to prove anything. That response, without spectacle, clashed with the theatricality around him. Some people on the avenue began commenting louder. The video already had a live audience. Laughter surfaced, now mixed with genuine curiosity. Doubt began to split the crowd. Carlos realized the situation was completely spiraling out of control. What had once been a mechanical issue was now becoming a public judgment, recorded and shareable. Caio sensed the tension and decided to push it further. He commented that it would be interesting to see how far the kid would go. He said that if the boy was wrong, at least it would make for a memorable video. The light tone hid something more aggressive. This stopped being a joke and started becoming provocation. Fernando finally lifted his eyes to Caio. There was no anger. There was firmness. He said he wasn't there for anyone's entertainment. That simple sentence landed strangely in the air, almost too out of place for an environment that had already turned into a show. Some laughter died down. Other phones were raised even higher. Carlos felt that, whether he liked it or not, the scene had crossed a line. Now there were partners involved, cameras rolling, and an audience hungry for an outcome. And at the center of it all, a boy who seemed not to understand the weight of the exposure. Or perhaps understood it better than anyone there. And it was in that atmosphere of a staged spectacle, between laughter and expectation, that someone threw out the idea that would change everything. A proposal set as a joke, but loaded with humiliation disguised as a challenge. The idea came up as a joke, but it was received as a challenge. Kaio, still holding the phone pointed at everything, commented that it would be interesting to put money on it, just to see how far that confidence would go. Someone laughed. Another encouraged it. Carlos, feeling the weight of the exposure, grabbed onto the proposal like a lifeline. Money had always been the language he controlled. If it became a bet, he would regain control. Carlos stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for the camera to catch it. He said he would pay $50,000 if the boy really managed to fix the Bugatti right there, without a shop, without new parts, without tricks. The amount landed heavily in the air. Some people covered their mouths. Others laughed in disbelief. It was more than money. It was a public trap. But there was a condition. If Fernando failed, he would have to admit out loud that he was lying. That he was nothing more than another kid trying to get attention. Carlos made it clear that everything would be recorded. No slipping away in silence. No excuses. The deal was simple. Either the boy would become an unlikely hero, or he would be humiliated in front of everyone, including the internet. Silence spread quickly. Even the horns seemed to fade. Fernando looked around, feeling the weight of expectations, cameras, and stares that no longer laughed so easily. It was a different kind of pressure. It didn't come from poverty, hunger, or hard labor. It came from exposure. And that was something he knew less about. Kaio moved the camera even closer, asking if the boy accepted. The tone was provocative, almost rooting for failure. Some partners whispered among themselves, calculating the video's impact. To them, any outcome would be good content. The boy's dignity was just a detail. Fernando took a deep breath. Looked at the car. Then at Carlos. He didn't ask for time. He didn't ask for help. He simply said he needed 15 minutes. Not to try. To do it. The simple answer caused immediate murmuring. 15 minutes sounded too short to be serious and too bold to ignore. Carlos laughed again, but this time the laugh was tighter. He agreed. 15 minutes. He said that would be the maximum time before the tow truck arrived. If the boy failed, the video would have a perfect ending. If he succeeded, he would pay. The confidence of money returned to Carlos's voice. At least that's how it sounded. Fernando nodded. There was no bravado. No visible fear. Just focus. He rolled up the sleeves of his grease-stained t-shirt slightly and took a few steps toward the Bugatti. For the first time, he truly approached the car everyone treated like an altar. And in that moment, as the clock started counting down, no one there could say whether they were about to witness an unlikely redemption or an irreversible public downfall. But everyone, without exception, knew they wouldn't be able to look away from what came next. Fernando didn't waste a second explaining what he would do. He opened the hood carefully, like someone respecting a living machine, and leaned in to listen once more. The heat rose intensely, white smoke still escaping in small pulses, but the boy seemed oblivious to it. His eyes moved quickly, connecting details invisible to those who only saw value and luxury. He began by removing smaller parts with no apparent rush, but with firm, precise movements. Each screw was placed on the ground in an organized way, as if there were a silent logic guiding the sequence. The contrast was striking. A boy working with grease-stained hands while men in tailored suits filmed, laughed, and counted the minutes out loud. Someone commented that it was madness. Another said there was no chance. Kaio moved the camera even closer, narrating every motion as if it were a game about to end badly. Fernando didn't react. His world had shrunk until it contained only that engine. Everything else was noise. He touched a specific hose, felt the irregular vibration, and made an almost imperceptible adjustment. Then he shifted a component that looked perfectly fitted but wasn't. To those watching, nothing seemed to change. To Fernando, everything was changing. The problem wasn't what was broken. It was what was out of place. Time was running. 10 minutes had already passed. Carlos checked his watch with a mix of anxiety and bitter expectation. Part of him wanted the boy to fail quickly so it would all be over. Another part, which he wouldn't admit, was beginning to fear the opposite. The silence grew as Fernando's movements became even more focused. The boy wiped his hands on his own shirt, listened to the engine one last time, and made a final adjustment. It was a simple gesture, almost mundane but loaded with intent. He closed the hood carefully like someone ending a ritual. He looked at Carlos and simply said he could try starting it now. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Caio moved the camera even closer, holding his breath as if waiting for the final mistake. Carlos hesitated for a moment before getting into the car. Those 15 minutes had passed far too quickly. Quickly enough that no one was sure what was really about to happen. Carlos turned the key. The sound that followed wasn't immediate. There was a brief delay that made everyone's heart stop for a second. And in that short interval, between fear and expectation, all the humiliation seemed on the verge of turning into something irreversible. The sound that came from the engine wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was clean, steady. A firm purr that left no doubt. The Bugatti came to life as if it had never failed, stable, precise, obedient. The smoke vanished almost immediately, as if erased by its own embarrassment. The silence that took over Reforma Avenue was louder than any horn that had come before. Carlos remained still for a few seconds, his hand still on the key. He blinked, looked at the dashboard, then straight ahead as if expecting a delayed error. It didn't come. The car was perfect, better than before. The engine responded with absolute smoothness. This wasn't luck. It was exact correction. Phones were still recording, but no one was laughing anymore. Some faces showed genuine surprise. Others, disbelief. A man who had been joking earlier now stood with his mouth slightly open, not knowing what to say. The humiliation had changed sides without warning. Fernando stayed beside the car, breathing deeply like someone finishing heavy work. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't celebrate. He simply observed the result, mentally confirming that everything was where it should be. His simple posture clashed violently with the impact of what had just happened. Carlos got out of the car slowly. The world around him felt different. Not because traffic had cleared, but because something inside him had shifted. He looked at Fernando without knowing what expression to use. There were no prepared words for that moment. No script of control. Caio was the first to break the silence, but his voice came out too low to sustain the mockery from before. He tried to laugh, tried to turn it into entertaining content, but the attempt died in the air. The video was no longer about failure. It was about exposure. And now not the boys. Someone started clapping. Another joined in. The sound spread, timid at first, then stronger. It wasn't a rehearsed applause. It was raw recognition. Fernando looked away, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, as if he would rather return to the anonymity of manual work. Carlos felt the weight of the collective gaze fall on him. Not as admiration. As silent accountability. He had laughed. He had humiliated. He had bet. And now he stood before a truth impossible to deny. The boy had done the improbable. In front of everyone. And before Carlos could decide how to react, before any words were spoken, the video had already gone beyond Reforma Avenue. That moment no longer belonged to that place. It was beginning to travel into a space where control would be even smaller. Traffic started moving again, but the story didn't stay there. As cars drove on, phones kept working. The video of the scene was already circulating in private groups, then on larger pages, then on profiles that lived off exposing public downfalls. Within hours, that moment stopped being local and spread like fire on dry ground. Comments appeared faster than any technical analysis. People who had never seen a Bugatti up close were now debating dignity, arrogance, and invisible talent. Carlos's name appeared alongside harsh criticism. Not because of the car. Because of the laugh. The contempt. The bet. The money that once symbolized power was now treated as an empty shield. Fernando, on the other hand, became a topic for opposite reasons. He wasn't called a miracle. He was called proof. Proof that knowledge doesn't live only in tall buildings or expensive workshops. Proof that skill doesn't ask permission to exist. Each replay reinforced the boy's calm and the contrast with the arrogance around him. The video crossed borders. It reached international pages, engineering profiles, channels that analyzed improbable human stories. The image of the grease-stained boy working with precision became a symbol. Not of exaggerated triumph, but of silent competence. That unsettled a lot of people. Carlos realized it had gone viral when his phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Messages from partners, associates, people asking for explanations. There was no way to control the narrative now. The frame was set. The internet didn't choose to laugh at him. It chose to question him. Caio tried to ride the wave, reposting the video with neutral captions, trying to look like part of the discovery. But the comments showed no mercy. Some recalled the provocation. Others highlighted the mocking tone at the beginning. The internet has a long memory when it decides to hold someone accountable. Fernando watched the video only once on his father's simple phone that night. He didn't smile. He didn't comment. He simply handed the phone back and said he needed to wake up early the next day. For him it was still just work. But the world had already decided to turn that moment into something bigger. And as likes, shares, and debates grew, a question began to surface behind the scenes. Who was that boy really? Where did that knowledge come from? And why had someone like him been invisible until that day? The workshop didn't draw the attention of anyone passing by. A simple door, worn paint, tools arranged with excessive care for such a small space. Felipe was sitting on a wooden bench when Fernando came in, still with the smell of grease on his hands. He didn't ask anything right away. He just looked at his son with the kind of gaze of someone who had already seen the world charge the wrong people far too much. Fernando told everything in just a few words. He didn't speak of the humiliation with anger. He didn't talk about the money with excitement. He described the facts the way he described engines, exactly as they happened. Felipe listened in silence, nodding now and then, as if each detail confirmed something he had always known. That talent wasn't an accident. It was the result of long nights, corrected mistakes, and hard-earned learning. Felipe explained something Fernando already felt but hadn't yet put into words. Money for them had never been a symbol of luxury. It was time. It was food on the table. It was the possibility of not having to close the workshop at the end of the month. Those $50,000 didn't represent victory. They represented breathing room. They represented continuity. The father ran his hand over the tools, like someone revisiting an entire history. He said he had learned mechanics by observing, making mistakes, and listening more than speaking. He said the world rarely recognizes those who work in silence. But when it does, it charges a different kind of price. Fernando listened closely, understanding that that day had opened doors that also carried risks. They talked about the video, about the exposure, about people who might show up with easy promises. Felipe was clear. Not every opportunity is a gift. Some come disguised as shortcuts. The workshop needed to remain what it had always been. A place of honest work, not a stage. Fernando looked around and realized how much that small space had shaped who he was. Every reused part, every improvised solution, every impossible repair done without resources. That had value. A value the world was now beginning to see, but one they had always known existed. Silence settled between the two of them, not as worry but as understanding. Something had changed outside those walls, but inside that workshop everything still needed to stay the same. At least for now. Because even without saying it out loud, they both knew that that simple calm wouldn't last much longer. And before the night ended, an unexpected knock on the workshop door announced that the outside world had already found its way to them. The knock on the door wasn't a single one. More followed in quick succession, accompanied by hurried voices and footsteps in the narrow neighborhood corridor. When Felipe opened it, he found cameras, microphones, and faces eager for a ready-made story. The simple workshop became an improvised set. The dust on the floor, the worn tools, and the dim light were framed as symbols of something bigger. Fernando watched everything from a corner, trying to understand how that intimate space had turned into a national headline. One reporter asked where he had learned all that. Another wanted to know if he had taken expensive courses. The answer was always the same: practice, observation, and discipline. The words sounded too simple for those searching for an extraordinary narrative. Felipe stepped in when he sensed a sensationalist tone forming. He said his son was not a miracle, nor a divine exception. He was the result of routine, effort, and constant study. He spoke firmly, protecting Fernando from labels that sounded like praise but hid dangerous expectations. This wasn't a spectacle for them. One network asked to film inside the house. The small living room became an improvised studio. They photographed used notebooks, borrowed books, handwritten notes. Fernando explained that he liked understanding how things worked, that taking things apart was the first step to learning how to put them back together better. He said he dreamed of becoming an engineer, not famous. That word carried weight. Engineer. Not influencer. Not instant celebrity. The contrast caught attention. A boy who didn't want applause but education. That touched part of the audience in an unexpected way. Social media began discussing merit, access, opportunity. The story stopped being just about a car. Meanwhile, Carlos watched everything from a distance. He saw the workshop, heard the answers, noticed the difference between the laughter he had offered on the avenue and the quiet dignity of that family. Something began to bother him for real. It wasn't guilt. It was an internal confrontation. A mirror he hadn't asked for. Carlos's daughter, Bianca, watched the entire interview. Each of Fernando's answers seemed to dismantle a layer of comfort she had about her father. When the reporter asked about respect, and Fernando replied that every kind of work deserved to be treated with dignity, Bianca felt the impact directly. It wasn't a hint. It was raw truth. The interview video spread almost as fast as the first one. Now there was no humiliation. There was context. And context changes everything. The public no longer just wanted to watch. It wanted to understand. And understanding required looking beyond the avenue. And as the media slowly pulled away, leaving the workshop quiet once again, a difficult conversation began to take shape inside Carlos's house. A conversation he had been avoiding for years, but one he could no longer put off. Bianca didn't wait for dinner to end. When Carlos walked into the living room, his phone still buzzing with unread messages, he found his daughter sitting on the couch, her posture far too firm for that hour. The television was off, but the interview still echoed in the air. There were no raised voices. There was something worse for him: clarity. She began by asking if he remembered the laugh. Not the car. Not the bet. The laugh. The question came calmly, almost casually, but it hit directly. Carlos tried to downplay it, said everything had been taken out of context, that the internet exaggerates. Bianca didn't argue right away. She simply said she had watched the entire video. And then the interview. And that the two versions didn't line up. She talked about dignity. About how Fernando answered questions without putting himself above anyone. About how Felipe protected his son without attacking anyone. And then she asked when it was that her father decided money gave him the right to dehumanize someone in public. The sentence wasn't spoken in anger. It was spoken in disappointment. That hurt more. Carlos defended himself the way he always did. He said the pressure was intense, that the day had been chaotic, that everyone makes mistakes. Bianca nodded but didn't back down. She said the mistake wasn't the problem. The problem was laughing. It was betting. It was turning someone into entertainment to save his own ego. That wasn't an accident. It was a choice. She said she remembered when he used to be different. When he taught that honest work deserved respect. When he didn't measure people by the car they drove. The memory landed like a low blow, but a true one. Carlos felt the weight of accumulated time, of the quiet compromises he had made with his own character. Bianca made it clear she wasn't there to cancel him or expose him. She was there because she didn't want to carry that example. She said the video didn't go viral because of the Bugatti. It went viral because it showed something many people recognized. An abuse too common to remain invisible. The silence between them stretched out. Carlos had no ready answer. For the first time he realized the problem wasn't public opinion. It was his own daughter's opinion. That wasn't something he could erase or control. Before leaving the room, Bianca said something that lingered in the air. That fixing a car is simple compared to fixing choices. That the boy had shown competence. Now it was up to her father to show character. And that didn't come with deadlines or guarantees. Carlos was left alone, staring at his own reflection in the black screen of the television. For the first time since the avenue, he felt that fixing something would require more than money. It would require a decision. And that decision was beginning to take shape in a way he didn't yet fully understand. Carlos didn't make any impulsive decisions that night. For the first time in a long while, he chose to observe before acting. The next morning he asked a trusted advisor to gather everything about the workshop, Silva and Son. Not to find flaws. To understand. He wanted to know how long they had been operating, what kind of clients they served, and what problems they solved when no one else would take the job. The reports came back quickly. Small, seemingly impossible repairs, improvised solutions that prevented bigger losses, loyal customers who always returned. No lawsuits, no complaints. Just survival built on detail. Carlos read everything in silence, realizing that the workshop operated with the same logic large companies claim to value but rarely practice: real efficiency. He also asked for an analysis of Fernando. A simple academic record, consistent grades, a clear interest in engineering and mechanics from an early age. No expensive courses. No privileges. Just talent refined by necessity. That unsettled Carlos in a different way. There were no shortcuts to criticize. No easy narrative to dismiss. After a few days, Carlos made a decision that surprised even his own partners. He sent a formal invitation for Felipe and Fernando to come to the company headquarters. No press. No cameras. Just a conversation. The invitation didn't explain the reason. Only the address, the date, and the time. The kind of invitation that usually makes people uneasy. Felipe was wary. He knew the world well enough to understand that not every summons from powerful people comes clean. Fernando listened in silence, analyzing the tone of the invitation more than the words. Something about it didn't feel like a threat, but it didn't feel like simple repair either. On the scheduled day, the two of them walked through the glass-walled reception area, immediately feeling the contrast. Marble floors, controlled silence, attentive employees. A different world. A world Fernando had only seen through videos and storefronts. Carlos was waiting for them in a spacious room, no security in sight, no unnecessary display of wealth. When Felipe entered, Carlos stood up. He didn't smile. He didn't apologize yet. He simply thanked them for coming. He said he needed to understand something in person. He needed to hear from them what the reports couldn't show. That sentence changed the atmosphere in the room. Fernando realized that the meeting wasn't about the past. It was about what would come next. And from the way Carlos looked at them, it was clear that this conversation would determine far more than a late apology. Carlos didn't start by talking about money. That alone surprised Felipe. He began by talking about mistakes. He didn't justify them or relativize them. He said that the way he had acted on the avenue didn't reflect the kind of company he claimed to lead, nor the kind of person he believed himself to be. The words came out measured, without theatrics, as if he were stepping onto ground he didn't fully command. Then Carlos went straight to the point. He said he wanted to invest in the Silva and Son workshop. Not to buy it. Not to absorb it and erase the name. To invest in order to modernize, expand, and give structure to what already worked. New equipment, adequate space, full regularization. No loss of identity. This wasn't charity. It was recognition. Felipe listened cautiously. Years of survival teach you to distrust beautiful promises. Carlos noticed and added the conditions. Everything would be formalized. Full transparency. The workshop would remain independent, but with technical partnership and logistical support from the company. No decisions without consent. No impositions. Then Carlos looked directly at Fernando. He said the investment only made sense if it included education. A full scholarship in mechanical engineering with real follow-up, not just name sponsorship. Fernando felt the impact like a silent shock. It touched exactly the place he had never had access to. Carlos went further. He spoke of a future partnership. Not immediate. Not symbolic. A real possibility conditioned on learning, growth, and ethics. He made it clear that talent without character didn't interest him. That sentence carried a different weight now. It wasn't a speech. It was a course correction. Felipe asked about control. About who would be in charge. Carlos answered without hesitation. He said he didn't want control. He wanted intelligent repair. He said that some debts aren't paid with checks, but with structured opportunities. That sounded too genuine to ignore. Fernando remained silent, absorbing every word. The proposal was too big to celebrate. Too big to reject without thinking. He didn't just see doors opening. He saw responsibility. He saw expectations. He saw a path that would demand more than skill with engines. Carlos ended by saying he didn't need an immediate answer. That decisions which change destinies shouldn't be made under pressure. That sentence closed the meeting but opened something larger. Because as father and son left that room, both knew that accepting would mean facing forces that hadn't appeared on the avenue. And one of those forces was already watching everything closely, too unsettled to remain silent for much longer. Caio didn't hide his discomfort when he learned about the proposal. Outwardly, he kept a professional tone, praising Carlos's initiative and pretending to support the partnership. Inside something was boiling. The idea of an unknown boy, coming from a small workshop, crossing doors it had taken him years to open was hard to swallow. It wasn't about merit. It was about territory. He asked to meet Fernando in person, under the pretext of evaluating his technical potential. He said he wanted to understand how the boy thought, how he solved problems under pressure. Carlos hesitated but eventually agreed, believing that transparency would prevent conflict. Fernando walked into the room knowing that meeting wasn't an invitation. It was a test. Caio started with questions that were too simple, almost insulting. Basic parts, obvious concepts, common situations. Fernando answered calmly, without hurry, explaining the reasoning behind each choice. That didn't satisfy Caio. He increased the complexity, changed scenarios, forced hypothetical errors, trying to corner him. When he realized he wouldn't be able to expose technical flaws, Caio changed strategy. He questioned the origin of the knowledge, insinuated that it was raw talent without refinement. He said the corporate world didn't work like a neighborhood workshop. The sentence carried contempt disguised as advice. Fernando listened to everything without reacting. When he answered, he was direct. He said engines don't lie and real problems don't ask for resumes. The room fell silent for a brief but heavy moment. That response wasn't a challenge. It was a statement. And it hit Caio hard. Envy began to show. Caio commented that big opportunities require people with the right profile. He looked at Fernando's simple clothes, at his marked hands, as if that were an argument. It wasn't technical. It was exclusion. Carlos realized too late that he had opened space for something he couldn't control. Fernando felt the implicit warning. That company had open doors but also dark corridors. He understood that the path wouldn't be just learning. It would be resistance. Caio wouldn't be a partner. He would be an obstacle. And obstacles with power rarely play fair. When the meeting ended, Caio shook Fernando's hand with excessive force, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He said he would be keeping an eye on him. The phrase sounded like a promise. Fernando left the room certain that the hardest repair in that story hadn't even begun yet. The closure of the workshop didn't come with prior notice. It came with a paper taped to the door early in the morning, official lettering, cold language, a clearly visible stamp. Felipe read it twice to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. Administrative irregularities. Operational risk. Immediate shutdown. Words far too big for such a small space. Fernando arrived shortly after and sensed the problem before even going inside. The tools were still there. The ongoing projects too. Clients were waiting for solutions that could no longer be delivered. Everything stopped by an anonymous complaint that had surfaced far too quickly to feel like coincidence. Felipe felt the weight of the blow not in his pocket but in his dignity. The news spread through the neighborhood within minutes. People who had known the workshop for years began to gather. They asked what had happened, offered help, wanted to understand. Felipe explained calmly, but inside he felt the same sensation as on the avenue, only reversed. This time there was no exposed luxury. There was interrupted work. Fernando examined the document with an attention unusual for his age. He noticed flaws, exaggerations, requirements outside the norm. This wasn't routine inspection. It was calculated pressure. He didn't say Caio's name, but he knew where the move came from. The corporate machine had begun turning against them. Some clients lost patience. Others defended the workshop loudly. An elderly man recalled a repair that had saved his only work vehicle. A mother told how Felipe had helped without charging when money was tight. The stories began piling up right there on the sidewalk. Felipe tried to stay calm, but fear crept in. Not of the distant future. Of the immediate. Bills, rent, food. That shutdown didn't hit just a business. It hit an entire network that depended on that space. Fernando felt responsibility weigh on him in a new way, heavier than any bet. Meanwhile, Caio watched from a distance, satisfied with the efficiency of the strike. Nothing public. Nothing traceable. Just normal procedures used as a weapon. To him it was course correction. A quiet reminder of who really held power. What Caio didn't foresee was that the closure wouldn't create silence. It would create reaction. And when injustice happens in a place too small to hide it, it starts to draw the attention of people who no longer accept pretending they didn't see. The shutdown didn't even last a full day in silence. By morning, there were already too many people on the sidewalk for it to be ignored. Residents, longtime clients, small local shop owners began gathering spontaneously in front of the workshop's closed door. There were no prepared signs. There were stories. And real stories always find a voice. One woman started by telling how Felipe had kept her car running for months, charging only what she could afford. A delivery driver spoke about a night when Fernando stayed late to fix a simple issue, charging nothing because he needed to work the next day. Each account dismantled the cold narrative of the paper taped to the door. Phones came out again, but this time with a different tone. It wasn't mockery. It was accusation. Videos showed the sealed door, people speaking, indignation growing. Someone remembered the Bugatti video. The connection was immediate. The boy praised by the internet was now being punished away from the main cameras. That didn't go unnoticed. Independent journalists arrived first. Then reporters from larger networks. The question changed. It was no longer, who is Fernando? It became, why was this workshop shut down so quickly? Pressure began to shift. The focus moved away from the shop and climbed the invisible hierarchy no one liked to name. Felipe tried to calm people down, saying he would resolve everything through legal channels. But the outrage wasn't just his. It was collective. This didn't look like inspection. It looked like retaliation. And retaliation, when exposed, tends to turn against those who use it. Carlos saw the images still at the office. He recognized the pattern too quickly to pretend surprise. The same method, the same coldness, the same invisible signature. He realized the situation had gone beyond any internal dispute. Now it was public. And now, someone would have to answer for it. Caio, on the other hand, underestimated the effect. He believed the movement would die down in a few days. He didn't understand that when injustice touches ordinary people, it grows deep roots. Every share brought a new name, a new look, a new question. Fernando watched everything in silence beside his father. There was no pride in that support. There was responsibility. He knew the movement hadn't started because of him, but now it passed through him. And that meant the next decision couldn't be passive. Because while the neighborhood united and the media pressed, Carlos had already decided he would no longer stay on the fence. What came next wouldn't be defense. It would be exposure. And someone very powerful was about to be unmasked. Carlos didn't call a meeting. He didn't make an announcement. He simply requested every report that usually went unread. Internal audits, parallel contracts, archive complaints, suspicious movements that had always been treated as administrative noise. For the first time, he wasn't trying to protect the structure. He was looking for the full truth. Caio's name began to appear with uncomfortable frequency. Fast-tracked permits, selective inspections, relationships that were far too close with agencies meant to remain neutral. Everything legal enough to go unnoticed in isolation. Illegal when viewed as a whole. It was a system of silent control, used to eliminate whoever became inconvenient. Carlos gathered evidence with surgical calm. He didn't confront Caio privately. He didn't offer a chance for quiet defense. He understood that this kind of power only works while operating in the dark. And he decided to turn on the light all at once. Lawyers, the press, and the board were activated simultaneously. When Caio was summoned, he assumed it was just another formality. He walked in confident, smiling. He walked out drained of color. Carlos presented documents, recordings, cross-referenced data. He didn't accuse with emotion. He simply exposed. Each item dismantled a piece of the image Caio had built over the years. The press received the complete material. There was no convenient editing. No controlled narrative. The same system Caio had used to sabotage the workshop now exposed him publicly. Headlines didn't speak of jealousy. They spoke of corruption, abuse of power, and corporate retaliation. Caio tried to react, claimed persecution, said it was all a misunderstanding. But the evidence didn't ask for interpretation. It demanded consequences. Within hours, he went from partner to defendant. The silence he tried to impose on the neighborhood now fell over him. Carlos watched the fall without celebrating. There was no victory there. There was late correction. He knew none of it erased the laugh on the avenue. But he also knew that failing to act now would make him a permanent accomplice. This was the bare minimum. And while Caio fell in front of everyone, the Silva and Son workshop still remained closed. Justice was beginning to move, but the true ending of that story would require something greater than punishment. It would require reconstruction. The workshop reopened on an ordinary morning, without an official ceremony, without long speeches, and without a ribbon to cut. The simple door lifted again as it always had, creaking slightly, faithful to its own history. But something was different. Not just in the physical space but in the air. People passing by slowed their steps, looked with renewed respect, as if that place had gone through a silent trial and come out stronger on the other side. Felipe went in first, walking slowly, touching the workbenches as if confirming that everything was still there. The new tools lived alongside the old ones without replacing them. Nothing had been discarded. Each object carried memory, learning, and resistance. This wasn't a transformation that erased the past. It was a worthy continuation of it. Growth that respected its origins. Fernando observed everything with calm attention. There were now modern machines, organized systems, space for study and testing. But the method remained the same. Listen, analyze, respect the problem before solving it. He knew that place wasn't just a renovated workshop. It was a center of excellence being born where no one expected it. Clients returned little by little, some emotional, others relieved. They didn't come just to fix cars. They came to confirm that justice could still work, even if late. Every handshake, every word of support, reinforced something no amount of money can buy. Trust built with time and consistency. Carlos visited the workshop days later, without an entourage, without the press. He didn't walk in as a savior, nor as an owner. He entered as someone who recognized limits. He spoke little. He observed a lot. He realized that space taught more about leadership than any boardroom he had attended for years. He saw Fernando explaining a technical issue to a neighborhood apprentice, with patience and clarity. There was no arrogance. No stage. There was knowledge being passed on. That hit Carlos harder than any public criticism. The legacy wasn't in the investment. It was in the posture. Felipe began guiding other small workshops in the area, helping with regularization, organization, and survival. What had once been an individual struggle became a collective reference. The neighborhood gained not just a strong business but a real support point. Something that holds up even when the cameras turn off. Fernando began his engineering studies with the same discipline he had always had. He didn't change the way he spoke or dressed. He changed only the reach of what he could do. He understood that his path wasn't about isolated personal rise. It was about opening the way for others who would never be invited. The Bugatti video continued to circulate, but now it carried a different meaning. It was no longer just reversed humiliation. It was the visible beginning of a chain of choices. Each replay reminded people that ignored talent comes at a cost. And that respect, when denied, returns in the form of exposure. Carlos, in turn, began to revisit old decisions, silent partnerships, and habits normalized by power. Not out of fear of the internet, but because he realized, late, that leadership without humanity becomes a caricature. The boy didn't just fix a car. He fixed a moral crack that many had pretended not to see. And as the workshop kept operating, training, teaching, and growing, it became clear that the story didn't end there. Because true legacies don't close with applause. They continue to be built every day, far from the spotlight, where character is tested without an audience. In the end, it wasn't about a Bugatti. It was about who you choose to be when no one owes you anything. It was about the laugh that humiliates, the bet that exposes, and the silence that reveals more than any words ever could. How many talents like Fernando's go unnoticed simply because they don't wear the right uniform of success? This story leaves an uncomfortable question. If that car had never broken down, how many doors would have stayed closed forever? How many incredible people remain invisible while the world applauds only those who are already at the top? And more importantly, which side would you have been on that avenue? Would you have laughed along? Would you have filmed it? Or would you have seen what almost no one saw in that moment? If this story made you think, comment below what you would have done in the Millionaire's place. And if you believe the world needs more stories that reveal value where no one thinks to look, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the next video might change the way you see power, money, and respect.